Okay, continuing with, we're now on chapter 9. Okay. Several years passed in this way. To the Ibis children, it all began to feel routine, normal, almost home-like. For Kyle and Elsa, that changed quite dramatically one day in the autumn of 1975. They had just returned from a routine mission. Due to limited memory, I cannot describe it further. As per usual, upon their return to base, they were undergoing their routine transfer from their adult human bodies back to their child bodies for the night. Oh, sorry, trying to move the pillow. Okay. But to their surprise, the transfer was cut short, and they opened their eyes as they were coming out of the tanks to find that they were still in their adult forms, and Dr. Krieger was standing on the ground, beaming ear to ear. She ushered Kyle and Elsa to her office once they had been handed robes. She instructed them to be seated, then herself sat behind her large mahogany desk and spoke. I have a wonderful announcement. The scan the tank performed showed us something magnificent. The purpose of your pairing has been successful, Wadjet. You are pregnant. A stunned silence fell over the room for a few moments. Then Kyle and Elsa erupted in shouts of joy and embraced. The embrace was short-lived, as Dr. Krieger intervened and broke them up, then led them to a new corridor they had never seen before. This one was labeled medical quarantine. It was a series of rooms with beds and toilets in them, separated from the corridor by airlocks. In each one there was also a window looking out onto the corridor, with a chair and intercom on either side of the glass. Elsa was brought into one of these rooms. Dr. Krieger, or it could be Krieger, explained that she was to be kept in this room for, for the duration of the pregnancy, and that the Golden Fleece would have to make do without her, and so it was. The missions continued. However, since the Golden Fleece was down a member, the missions were simplified, usually simple in and out assassination ops. Every day before every op, and again after if he could, Kyle would go to see Elsa and they would talk either through the intercom or through telepathy. They discussed their hopes for the future and for their child. Telepathically, they fantasized about the possibility of escaping to some far-flung location to be a family. At around 2 months into the pregnancy, Elsa swore she saw their child in a dream. She said that the child was a girl and that she would grow to be a gorgeous dark-haired woman with Kyle's periwinkle eyes. They decided to name their daughter Irina. After Kyle's by now largely forgotten mother. Their happiness turned out to be short-lived. It all came crashing down on one day in March of 1976. The day began normally. Kyle looked in on Elsa before leaving on the op of the day, as he always did. Nothing seemed amiss. On return in the evening, he stole away to look in on her again. He found that Elsa was seated in a far corner of the room in a fetal position. He felt considerably concerned at the sight of this and spoke immediately into the intercom. Elsa? There was no response. Elsa, can you hear me? Are you all right? Once again, Elsa did not respond. Kyle decided to take matters into his own hands. He punched the glass. It was thick, but not made to survive a punch from an enhanced soldier. It shattered into a million pieces, and a deafening alarm sound started blaring out. Kyle paid the alarm no mind, leapt through the window, and bounded over to the Elsa-shaped bundle in the corner, grabbed her by the shoulders, giving her a gentle shake. "Elsa, what is wrong?" Elsa just barely looked up, her face as pale as a ghost, and in a shaking voice replied to Kyle, "They took our baby, Kyle. They took our baby. I fell asleep, and when I woke up, she was gone. I can feel it. She's not there anymore. Oh, Kyle, what are we to do?" Before Kyle could reply or even absorb these words, he was being grabbed from behind by guards. He struggled but was restrained, as was Elsa, both of them by now screaming every profanity in every language they knew. They were taken, restrained, to Dr. Krieger's office and sat in the same chairs where they had first been told of Elsa's pregnancy, and left restrained. Dr. Krieger soon showed up to explain. Yes, it turned out Elsa and Kyle's baby had been stolen. Dr. Krieger never named the sex of the baby, though Kyle accepted Elsa's psychic intuitions of it being a girl. Dr. Krieger stated that the baby had been sent off-world, first to an artificial womb, to one day be adopted by a, quote, good German family, unquote, in an off-world colony. The doctor then left the couple in their seats, restrained, making one final remark as she left. "You know, you two, you should have foreseen this. Raising this child was never going to be done by you. You should be happy to have fulfilled your purpose." Elsa made eye contact with the doctor, her face containing the most cutting, venomous look Kyle had ever seen, and would see again for a great many years, and spoke an equally cutting reply, in German, Dr. Krieger's mother tongue. She spoke in a dangerously calm and measured tone, one that quite visibly shook all those who heard it. "Well, doctor, I was quite happy to think I would be having my daughter with this man I was paired to fall in love with. So, doctor, why don't you go fuck yourself?" The couple were left restrained for several hours alone, so they could begin to come to terms with what had occurred. They were then returned to their child bodies and put to bed for the night. The next day it was business as usual again. Kyle and Elsa's child was the only successful product of the breeding program of IBIS. None of the other pairs bore children. If Kyle and Elsa's child was kept born on schedule with no time travel, she'd have been born in July of 1976. And if she's alive, is no doubt considered borderline royalty to the off-world Germans. Grief took its toll. Kyle and Elsa became withdrawn, both socially from their unit and sexually from each other. Time no doubt would have healed the wound eventually, but it was not to be. Project Ibis came to an end just 2 months after the theft of the baby. In retrospect, perhaps it was an omen to the project's inevitable failure. How this part of Kyle's life ended, plus its aftermath, will be disclosed in the following chapters. Author's note: a dark chapter indeed, but extremely common in Kyle's circles, and it will not be the last such tale to be told over the course of his life. If any readers are by chance aware of the outcome of Kyle and Elsa's daughter, please let me know. July 1976. I'm going to think out loud for a second. Does that mean an Earth child that was born then on Earth? Or something else? Or somebody could recognize or remember this as them, but if so, maybe that person was... Anyway, you know what I'm saying. Okay, July 1976, Chapter 10. Hey, that was a short chapter. Okay. That fateful night, all started completely normally, with the golden fleece and all the other assets being put back in their child bodies and their associated crib cages for the night. Kyle was awoken from a deep, dreamless sleep by the unmistakable and all too familiar sound of combat echoing down the halls of the base. Almost immediately, the gunfire and shouting was followed by alarms, as well as all the lights coming on. Kyle attempted to break out of the crib, but this proved fruitless. The shouts in familiar German and Canadian accented voices were soon joined by more shouts in unfamiliar British accented voices. Several times bullets flew through the door to Kyle's room. He hit the deck as he'd been trained, but felt rather unsafe as the bottom of the cage was at least a foot off the floor. Eventually, there was a total blackout. The alarm stopped too. Kyle was left again in total darkness, save from the flashes of bullets that could be glimpsed through the holes made in the door. And then nothing. Silence fell just as rapidly as the commotion had begun. The silence was short-lived, however. It was followed by the sounds which always follow a battle: screams of pain and shock, shouts for medics, and conversation. Kyle listened closely to the conversation. He'd been trained in situations like this to listen for who was speaking in broken accent, a language that was obviously not their own. The speaker would be the victors, taking the survivors as hostage. The voices were faint at first, but when he finally heard them, what he heard was British men speaking in broken German. The Brits had won. Eventually, he heard two British soldiers arguing in the corridor outside his cage room, their flashlights occasionally flashing up and down the passage. Can't fucking see. I'm not going any further in this dark. Start opening the rooms. This is the containment wing. If these kids they told us about are still here, they'll be in these rooms. Mate, I can't see anything down here. I'm not opening these fucking doors until I can see. We don't know what's behind them. A young soldier, by the sound of his voice, and obviously shaken and afraid of what might be lying in wait. All right, I'll get you some goddamn lights. Calm the fuck down, Edwards. If there was something waiting to bite your nuts off, they'd have done it already. How does that make this fucking better? The young soldier, apparently named Edwards, demanded. While he waited for the lights and to be discovered, Kyle weighed the situation. On the one hand, his side had clearly lost for now, yet he was already thinking, did he have any loyalty left after what had happened? No, he decided he did not. Not after stealing his child. And if how these soldiers talked was any indication, they were just that, soldiers, the same as he was. It was in that moment that he decided that he was no longer German or anything but a simple soldier. Whether this new and rather naive conviction would last is up to the reader to decide as they read how Kyle's life continued and how his thinking came to evolve. The lights did come back on rather quickly. Someone must have managed to rig the base's generator. Almost immediately, the door to Kyle's cage room was kicked in. Two soldiers wielding SLR LIAI rifles, L1A1, SLR L1A1 rifles entered. Kyle held his hands up. The guns were lowered. The soldiers weren't eager to shoot a caged 6-year-old. One unlatched the top of the cage and lifted Kyle out, then carried him to the corridor. Other contained ibis children were being pulled out there as well. Soon all the containment rooms containing the children were emptied, and all the ibis children, who were all by now between the ages of 5 and 9 years old, had been brought from their captivity. One of the British soldiers called for a head count. The answer came back momentarily. 42 children in total. The soldiers then ushered the children into a nearby room, away from the dead and injured. Some put up a token resistance, but most simply went along, their loyalty having vanished already. The soldiers and children sat around in the large empty room, apparently a storage room that had never been filled. The soldiers at first began trying to entertain the children, but quickly realized that these were not children as they knew them. These were soldiers in small bodies, and made obvious that they expected to be treated as such. Eventually a man entered the room, obviously a general by his dress uniform, which Kyle recognized as belonging to the British Royal Army. He addressed the crowd of soldiers and assets. Right, now, ladies and gents, we're leaving before these Nazi fucks get in any backup. Prisoners in Convoy A, children in Convoy B. I've already dispatched a commando to load up any files and or hard drives. Let's load out. Sir, yes, sir. Before the orders could be carried out, one of the ibis girls approached the general. She was not a member of the Golden Fleece, so Kyle did not know her name, but he would find out many years later. It will not be revealed here for reasons of privacy concerns. Sir, what is this? Where the fuck are we going? The general was visibly taken aback by the swearing coming from such a young mouth, but said nothing to indicate this, instead answering her question. Well, young lady, I suppose you deserve an answer. You're to be taken away. You will all be given a station once we've sorted everything out. But you won't be staying here. None will. This base and all that's in it is now the property of Her Majesty. With that, he turned and marched away, apparently having said all that he was willing, and decided that the children should also find it satisfactory. The soldiers and children gathered themselves and left. The ibis children had no possessions to carry with them. Wherever they were going, it would be an entirely fresh start. Kyle found himself with a feeling at this realization, one he couldn't quite identify. Something approaching excitement, perhaps, or possibly even a sense of hope. The children, as they left, found themselves marching out of habit more than anything. The soldiers found this to be quite an amusing sight. After the elevator ride up, the children and soldiers were divided. A convoy of what must have been at least 30 lorries were waiting, 8 of them which had Red Cross symbols on the side. These were already being loaded with the injured and dead. A few were also being loaded with those taken prisoner. Among the latter group, Kyle recognized Kramer and Dr. Krieger, as well as most of the medical and scientific personnel, mostly still in their night clothes. He did not see Emmerman, whom he only then remembered hearing was not on base that day. What would become of him when he returned, Kyle wondered. As they passed the scientific prisoners, on their knees beside one of the lorries, Elsa stopped in front of Dr. Krieger, smiled, and spat in the doctor's face. Dr. Krieger rose, shouting invectives in German, but was brought back to the ground immediately by the butt of a rifle. "Calm yourself down, Nazi bitch. Where you're going, you'll wish they were only spitting on you," barked the soldier who had knocked her down. The Ibis children were loaded into 4 of the remaining lorries, divided by groups of 10, save for the final truck, which was loaded with 12. In each truck, 2 soldiers rode with them. The truck soon enough left the Ibis base, by which time it was very early morning, the sun just beginning to rise. The 4 trucks bearing their precious cargo drove for 48 hours across Canada, accompanied by a 5th which carried their food. They took only back roads through the countryside of Canada, through incredible scenery, stopping only when someone needed to answer nature's call, or to eat their food, which consisted of MREs so vile that Kyle wondered if they were made from human shit, like that which they had eaten on Mars. The children talked among themselves, including eventually to those outside their units, as they suddenly realized that the old constraints against such no longer applied. They spoke of both the future and the past, from whence they had come and from whence they might be going. Very little was explained to them. Indeed, it was unlikely that the soldiers accompanying them knew anything more than they did. The trucks pulled up after approximately 48 hours of driving onto a commercial strip, Yonge Street, in Toronto. One of the soldiers explained to the group of children, who were just beginning to awaken due to the urban sounds which were now surrounding the convoy. Yonge Street. The street was just beginning to come to life as the group arrived. It was lined on both sides with office buildings from a patchwork of eras. Groups of people in their office wear were entering them. Only a few so much as looked up at the sight of 42 children, barefoot and in striped pajamas, being unloaded from lorries, then being walked through the streets by a group of heavily armed soldiers, so preoccupied were they by their corporate imprisonment. The children were led to the back of one of the buildings through a back door, then in groups up an elevator in one of the back hallways. No one disturbed or even saw them. They were taken to the top floor of this building. What must have been intended for office space had been converted into a housing area for the delivered children. The room was filled with army cots, divided down the middle by a set of Japanese screens, one side for boys, the other for girls. "Girls on the left, boys on the right. Please find a bed and change into the clothes laid out for you. Make yourselves right at home," one of the soldiers instructed. The assets were all still wearing the same striped pajamas and bare feet they had been issued on the night the Ibis base was seized. The clothes turned out to be a set of youth-size military fatigues, a pair of wool socks, and a pair of brown loafers. Oh my God, brown loafers. Why did you have to say that? Not penny loafers. Okay. These clothes were too big for all but the oldest children, but none cared. They were beginning to feel liberated. Eventually they were issued food. This was still packaged food, but far better tasting than the MREs they had eaten on the drive to Toronto, this consisting of various types of prepackaged snacks, both sweet and savory. It was here that Kyle discovered his love of both potato chips and Jaffa cakes. Eventually a woman showed up, Canadian, judging by her accent. She began calling the children out by name, one by one, in alphabetical order. They'd been gone for hours at a time. Soon it became known her purpose. She was something called a social worker, and was interviewing each Ibis child about their experiences. As each interview took so long, and the woman left at 5 p.m. each day, the process wound up taking over a fortnight in total. The children bathed with a combination of the washcloths handed out to them and the hand soap found in the bathroom on this floor of the office building, which was apparently unoccupied by anyone else. The wait was unexciting but cheerful. The British soldiers never once mistreated any of the Ibis children, and eventually came to treat the assets as their fellow soldiers. Not once did they beat the children for speaking too loudly or not loudly enough, or for swearing in public, or for asking for food or the toilet at non-designated times, nor any of the other myriad abuses that they had become used to at the Ibis base. It became nearly euphoric. On the third day of the wait, the social worker called Kyle's name. He went with her. She took him down a floor in the building into an office. A rather depressing windowless affair, it reminded Kyle more of an interrogation room than an office, save for the desk covered in papers. There was also a calendar on a wall. The date showed it as May the 11th, 1976. Okay, Kyle did a calculation and realized that this meant the Ibis children had been liberated on May the 6th of 1976. Coincidentally. Okay, the social worker, a sweet, overweight redhead, introduced herself as Sarah, then sat behind the desk across from Kyle and produced a tape recorder. Hey, Mace, that was just the other day. May, okay. Tell me your story when you're ready, she said, and that he did. He told everything he knew of Ibis as well as his own story. His abduction from Koningshuta, the programming and ritual abuse he and his comrades had undergone at the hands of the Aquino family, the theft of his and Elsa's child, and every other crime he had witnessed. He also told the names of every perpetrator and victim that he knew, as well as every name he could remember seeing or hearing while on missions. Sarah let him continue as long as he could, only stopping him to ask for clarifications, switch out tapes in the recorder, or grab food and drinks when Kyle requested them. The process must have taken 6 hours. At the end, Sarah stated to Kyle that it was surely the most exhaustive testimony that she had heard so far. Perhaps someday this testimony will become public record, like the Nuremberg testimony that came before it. Eventually, once the testimonies had all been heard, the assets waited again. 2 days went by, and life continued. On the third day, everything changed. Sarah once again began calling the assets names, and they dutifully left. They soon returned to say their goodbyes as well as to gather whatever meager possessions they had acquired, usually just a few changes of underwear, and perhaps a book or two that they may have been given by one of the soldiers. It turned out the children had already been found new postings and were being sent off. Kyle's name was called eventually, and he left. "We found you a posting, Herr Del Schau," she said. "Please gather your things." "Where will I be going?" "Cornwall, England. That's all I know. Besides that, it'll be far better than your last posting. Have a safe trip." Kyle returned and gathered his few belongings, which now included a copy of Casino Royale that one of the soldiers had given him. He was already assimilating British culture. He said his goodbyes. He'd have made a lot more of them, particularly the goodbye to Elsa, if he'd known this was the last time he'd ever see any of his Ibis comrades again. Sarah and two soldiers led them downstairs in the building to the alleyway from whence he and the others had arrived. Outside, an armored limousine was waiting, with 3 soldiers inside, in dress uniform this time, but still British Royal Army, as well as one civilian man in an Armani suit. They were quite decent and polite, but provided no real answers to Kyle's questions about where he was going. The group drove to an airfield somewhere outside of Toronto, where a nondescript passenger plane was waiting. The soldiers and suited man who had accompanied Kyle continued to do so onto the plane and then the flight to England. As it turned out, Kyle never saw any of the Ibis assets again, at least not in the forms he had known them. Nor did he ever learn the fates of Dr. Krieger or most of the rest of his tormentors. However, Emmerman's presence in Kyle's life would eventually continue, as would Commander Aquino's, and much later, Kramer would also reappear. Kyle soon fell asleep on the plane. He was awoken only by the landing. He looked out the window to see the runway, which was perched somewhat alarmingly close to the beautiful sea cliffs of Cornwall. And so, Ibis now well and truly in his past, Kyle's new life began. Author's note. Well, it's done. The story of Project Ibis has been told as well as I could, with my limited memories of it. However, Kyle's story has only barely begun. I hope the reader is excited for the continuation of it all. Okay, I just have to move over here, then I'm going to keep reading. Okay. Chapter 11. This particular stage of Kyle's life, the period in England before being sent to Montauk, is very faint in my memory, even though this phase took up 7 years. Only a few chapters of this book can be dedicated to it due to this. I will try my best, however, to describe a few highlights. Once the Montauk stage begins, the level of detail will go up massively. Kyle alighted from the plane and, after an urgent trip to some nearby bushes to relieve himself, which visibly shocked the 2 very refined military men, was loaded into another armored limousine like that which had brought him to the airfield near Toronto. It was as they were driving away that he began to take note of a certain sensation that had hit him a few days earlier. Something akin to exhaustion, but not quite the same. He would later realize this was withdrawal, both from being an avatar most of the time and from the drugs and nanites that had been so regularly pumped into his system. The limousine drove quite a distance. After a bit, Kyle, with permission, rolled down a window and stuck his head out, enjoying the famous English sea air and the spectacular views. The limousine eventually pulled up in front of a large single-story white house, quite isolated from any other visible buildings. It also overlooked the sea. "Welcome to your new home," one of the soldiers said. Outside the house stood a family, a young couple, both tall and brunette, and a daughter who looked about the same age as Kyle. Before Kyle could get out, the man in the Armani suit pulled a briefcase from under his seat, produced a clipboard, alighted from the limousine, and rushed up to the family in front of the house. The two men and the woman all signed the clipboard. Then the suited man gestured at the car. One of the soldiers nudged Kyle, and he got out and approached the family with a growing sense of trepidation. Just what was all this anyway? The man of the family extended his hand to Kyle. "How do you do, young sir? Adam Blackwell. My wife Anna. My daughter Honey." Here's my cat's face. She's trying to get in my way. Because I said my daughter Honey. Okay, wait. "How do you do, young sir? Adam Blackwell. My wife Anna. My daughter Honey. Welcome to your new home." Kyle shook his hand, but decided to clear the air and remove any misconceptions with his introduction. "Kyle Delshaw. May as well say it now, sir. I am not a child. I've spent much of my life in an adult body. I speak 3 languages. I've had carnal relations with multiple women. I can use a wide range of weapons. I swear when I feel like it. I am a man in a small body. Nothing more, nothing less." Adam Blackwell was visibly amused, as was his wife, but he carried it like a gentleman. "Yes, Herr Delshaw, I was briefed. You will be treated accordingly. But—" Blackwell bent down and whispered in Kyle's ear, "Let us do try to keep the profanity and discussion of carnal relations to when my wife and daughter can't hear, shall we?" Kyle agreed, and introductions made, entered the home of the Blackwell family. It proved to actually be quite spacious on the inside and furnished in a traditional English style, though the amenities were all quite modern. Kyle found his room. It was already stocked with clothing and the bed made up. The Blackwells had obviously prepared quite quickly for their new charge, and so Kyle began to settle into his new home. At dinner, Kyle broached the subject of his station, quote unquote, and just what was to be expected of him. He was growing increasingly exhausted of all this crypticness. Was it an English trait, he wondered? "Well," Adam Blackwell said to Kyle's posed question, "I suppose it's fair of you to ask. This family works for an organization by the name of MI6. Perhaps you'll have heard of it." "Yes, it's run by Semites and money launderers," Kyle commented. This was what he had been taught, though now he said it more for shock value than as a serious statement. His reading of Casino Royale had in fact made him respect the organization, but he decided it was best to keep the Blackwells on their toes. The Blackwells raised eyebrows at this statement of his, but decided to not argue yet. "Well, you seem to know your stuff, then. All we know is that they have great interest in your history with off-planet operations, themselves being rather understaffed in that arena," Anna Blackwell said. Kyle realized it was the first time he had heard her speak. "And your child? She, too, works for them?" Kyle asked, gesturing toward young Honey. "I'm not a child," Honey piped up at the perceived insult. "Yes, she does. We all play our part in service to Her Majesty's government," Adam said in reply. Not much more was explained, and after dinner, Kyle took a shower, his first real one since leaving the Ibis base. The hot water seemed almost sinfully indulgent to him. He then retired to bed to be plagued by bizarre dreams of Elsa in a series of increasingly frightening locations. He awoke not much rested, but in anticipation of what might come next. After breakfast, which happened to be Kyle's first taste of an English breakfast, the Blackwell family, including Kyle, piled into the Blackwell's green station wagon. Adam hinted they were taking Kyle to, quote, meet his new bosses, unquote. The drive took 5 hours, not including stops. Speaking of stops, I have to do something. It'll just take a second. Alrighty, okay. The drive took 5 hours, not including stops. The Blackwells drove from the north shore of Cornwall all the way to London and through London to the MI6 building at Vauxhall Cross, Vauxhall, Cross, Cross. In spite of himself, Kyle enjoyed the ride. He was coming to love England. London particularly enraptured him. He had never in his life seen so many types of people or such massive constructions. Adam Blackwell swore a good deal at the traffic, which slowed the drive, and young Honey whined, but Kyle was thankful for it, as it gave him a chance to view London further and longer. The group eventually pulled into the underground car park, where they were met by a valet, a huge black man in a long and obviously quite expensive coat, and white silk gloves. It was Anna Blackwell who first spoke to the man. "Good afternoon, Terence. We have a newcomer. This is Kyle, our obscure young cousin from..." Kyle decided to interject before she could insult him by attributing an incorrect nationality, and stepped forward, his hand outstretched. "Guten Tag, Herr Terence. My name ist Kyle Delschau." Then, switching to English, he continued, "I have been sent to live with the Blackwell family as a part of my new assignment." "We get, Herr Delschau. I trust they are taking good care of you." I didn't say that right, but the valet said in a thick Jamaican accent. "Well enough," Kyle replied. He'd have continued the conversation, but Adam began ushering him on, and into the building they went. The building was massive and ultra-modern on the inside, with black and white checkered floors and sleek white walls, adorned with the occasional piece of modern art, and an even more occasional classical art piece that wound up looking anachronistic in such a place. The Blackwells and Kyle moved through this, unmolested, until they reached a massive bank of elevators. Inside the elevator, the group entered. Above the floor buttons was a keypad. Adam typed in a code, then pressed the floor button labeled SB-14, the 14th sub-basement. The level they arrived at proved equally impressive to the one at ground level. Upon exiting the elevator, Adam directed Kyle to a small waiting room just beyond. "Wait in there. The rest of us have work to do," he instructed, then promptly left with Anna and Honey. So Kyle went and waited, wondering all the while how anyone was supposed to recognize him and come get him. Had all of this truly been planned out in such detail already? Kyle wondered. He didn't have long to wait. A tall, dark-haired woman fetched him and walked him through a door to the side of the waiting area. What followed amounted to a combat fitness review panel. Kyle was led through a series of rooms in which a bevy of medical personnel conducted various tests. His blood and urine were taken, his vision, hearing, and reflexes were tested. At one point, he was made to run on a treadmill while wearing a belt to which a tangle of wires was attached. They even briefly tested his competency with firearms. The process in total took about 11 hours. The fact that Kyle showed no tiredness itself proved his status as an enhanced soldier. No normal child would have made it through this process without collapsing from sheer exhaustion. At the end of the process, he was shown in an office. The plaque on the door read, Commander Alfred Bonner, DOPO. Kyle's interest was piqued both by the obviously dramatic name and the mysterious acronym, DOPO. As he entered the office, a huge blond German man rose from behind the desk. He gave Kyle the customary Sieg Heil. Kyle was shocked to see it in such an environment, but he returned it. Perhaps this place wasn't going to be so unfamiliar. After all, I was just listening to Jordan Maxwell saying that the whole British royalty is Nazi. The Queen and everything are all German. He was just talking about that when I took a break earlier. Jordan Maxwell. So anyway, it's kind of funny. Okay. After the greeting, the man rounded the desk and introduced himself to Kyle, his hand outstretched. I am Commander Alfred Bonner, Director of Off-Planet Operations. DOPO, Kyle echoed. Yes, quite. I'll cut to the point, Herr Delschau. The timing of bringing you here has proven quite serendipitous. You already carry enhancements and training in my department. I see, but if I may, how is my coming serendipitous? Because, Herr Delschau, if you'll pardon my French, I'm fucking underfunded. I suppose you've not had access to the news. To put it succinctly, Her Majesty's government is spending so much on fighting the goddamn Irish that they forgot that this little shithole city they love so much is but a dot on a planet which itself swims among other cities. I don't agree with calling your lovely city a shithole, but I'm glad to assist. Bonner chuckled. Wait until you see Soho. Then you'll reevaluate. Though it is good if you need a night of passion, which brings me to my next point. You're to be age advanced. You'll no longer be forced to inhabit that small body. You make avatars? Not precisely. We have a machine that can alter one's age. We acquired it from the Americans back in '56. You will be advanced to the mental age that was foisted upon you. After a bit more discussion of Kyle's new contract, the nature of which escapes me, Bonner used his desk phone to call in a person from the laboratory, and a woman escorted Kyle to the designated area. Inside, he was greeted by a regeneration tank, like those he was familiar with from the Ibis base, except that this particular one was filled with an opaque, light pink fluid. He was lowered in, fell unconscious, and emerged an adult man, looking just like his adult avatar had. He excused himself to the toilet he had glimpsed in one of the hallways to relieve himself of the urges he had been overcome with by the sudden rush of adult hormones. Quite a pleasant interlude for him as he'd begun to miss his own sexuality. Boy, get used to this, huh? Let's see, wait a minute. And so it was. The next morning, Kyle was returned to the Blackwells, and his new life and assignment began. Never again would he be in a child's body. That's crazy. The Blackwells told their neighbors that Kyle was their obscure German cousin, who had come to live with them after losing his job, a cover story that Kyle never objected to. A few more bits of the next 7 years will be told in the following chapters. Author's note. I hope the reader will excuse the lack of detail in this and the following 3 chapters. These are hard to access memories for me. Once this phase is over, the detail will return. Okay, we're at 49 minutes. I'm gonna end this particular video here and come back beginning with chapter 12. Adios.